And of course, it's Monday, so it's because my monitor not on and me and see nothing, me know what's going on. Sorry. Right, so it's Monday, so of course, we are Inspector Steve Mc Kenzie is back here with us. And after what happened in the Savannah last week, Sunday, people are still talking about whether or not the police should have used the tear gas to disperse the crowd. So this Monday, we're going to be talking with Inspector about the use of force policy of the TTPS. Good morning to you, Inspector.
Good morning, Natalie. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. It's a pleasure to be here once again.
Yeah, so talk to us. What is this use of force policy?
Well, use of force pretty much speaks for the name, use of force. It speaks to police officers in terms of the level of force that we are required to use in a given situation. Of course, our force is generally to get compliance from some person or suspect who may not be following the instructions or may be violent in a particular manner or so. So our authority in terms of the use of force comes from the Criminal Law Act under Section 4. And it tells us that we can use force that is reasonable in these circumstances.
And who determines that reasonableness of the force in the particular circumstances?
The officer. So the officer has to consider all the factors there and then. He has to bear in mind his experience. He has to bear in mind the laws of the land. He has to bear in mind the consequences to follow, and of course the situation as a whole. Once the officer understands that he uses as well the equipment available to him, and of course the number of police officers that are there as well. So there's a number of factors that one would consider in the use of any force at any given time. So as an example, if as a police officer you are using force to, as I said, get compliance from a suspect, if the suspect is armed, as an example, you have to use force that is reasonable. So the fact that someone is armed with let's say a cutlass, walking at the side of the road, doesn't require any type of force that is deadly or otherwise, because you may have that person to be considered to be passive. Passive meaning there's no form of aggression, there's no form of indiscipline, there's nothing that requires the officer to engage the person in a violent manner. However, if that person were to take the same cutlass and advance towards a group of persons, the officer may have to use a different level of force to require compliance. That level of force will be dependent again on the circumstances. If, for instance, if that person is an elderly person and the group of persons he is charging towards is, let's say, a group of footballers, young, energetic young persons, again, the officer takes into consideration the activity, what is happening there. And there may not be a need for that level of force that is required. Now, as I said before, the force used by a police officer has to be consistent with actually what is happening. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have to bear in mind other considerations. So if an officer uses force, we have to consider what happens to persons who may be standing.
So, Inspector, let me ask you this. Is it that any officer, regardless of rank, can make that decision in that moment based on what is happening on the ground?
To use force?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As I said before, we are required to use force as is reasonable in the circumstances. There are some instances where the level of force used will be required, or the instruction to use the level of force will be given by senior police officers.
Well, that's what I was asking, if everybody, regardless of rank, has that authority.
And I'll give you an example of what I'm speaking about. So we spoke about the crowds and the situation that happened not yesterday, but last week. So whenever we have to deploy that type of gas, it's not the average police officer would give that instruction. That is a senior police officer, an officer who is considered to be an ex officio justice of the peace by virtue of his rank. He would give the instruction based on the set circumstances. Again, we are looking for compliance. We are causing, or we are attempting to control a situation before it gets worse.
Yeah.
Now, it's always easy in relation to your use of force to have the time, no stress, no pressure, no social media, no mass media, no political interference or whatever, to judge the actions of the police officer who had the limited opportunity to make a decision, who had, based on the set circumstances ahead of him, a short window in which he has to do or not do. And of course, based on his action, things could get worse, or of course, they can be quelled. So the officer, who has a very limited amount of time, as I said before, has to use his experience, has to bear in mind the amount of persons that he has, and of course the equipment that he has, and make that decision, that timely, decisive decision after, of course, much conversation with the intended suspect before the use of force is used.
But Inspector, let us be honest. We have seen, because of the advent of social media, we have seen videos where we thought that the use of force was excessive in regarding what was happening on the ground. And when you say to me that even with the deployment of gas that you have to get permission from a senior officer, if that officer is not on the scene, how do you determine that the information related to him is as such that it's really truly representative of what's happening in the moment?
So every time a police officer uses force, or every action of a police officer, he can be held to account. Whenever there are situations like that, in terms of deployment of our what we call non-lethals or less lethal devices, we have to submit reports to our seniors that will go directly to the Commissioner of Police. The action of the police officer can be, in the event that he has erred, he can face disciplinary proceedings. There's a possibility as well he can even face criminal or civil proceedings. So there is accountability. The organization is one that we strive very, very high on our discipline. We have many instances where persons who are foul of the law are brought before the court, and we show to John public exactly what we do. We are very transparent in that regard. We show what we do in relation to persons who are foul of the law. So, yeah, and again, even as it relates to our options, we have less lethal devices. So it's not always a case of going for the extreme. Under the previous commissioner, that particular non-lethal was brought actually into play. So today we have police officers who are trained and authorized to use less lethal devices such as pepper sprays and tasers. And of course, those things are not absolute. The circumstances has to be right for the use of those devices. No, and as I said...
Inspector, I have to cut it because we have about a minute left, but a scenario just crossed my mind. We have a lot of people in the society who are mentally ill.
Yeah.
And, you know, if the police is called on the scene, I know that they're not trained to deal with people who are mentally ill, and it's not an offense to be mentally ill.
Correct.
You know, so if a police officer has to approach somebody who is mentally ill and might cause harm, how do you treat with that person as compared to how you treat with, you know, a citizen who you could say, okay, this person is in his or her right mind?
Correct. So again, those non-lethal that we just spoke about, those less lethal, should I say, those are things that we can use. It's not always advisable to use less lethal devices on those persons. For instance, the elderly, pregnant women, persons, or young persons, we try to avoid those things. Of course, unless the situation is one where there's a possibility that the person may harm themselves to the point of death, or the actions of the person may cause death also upon another. So again, the officer has to...
But somebody with mental health might be more violent.
That's right. They may be more violent.
Right.
So it comes back to...
But even in those circumstances, if you recognize that this person suffers from mental illness,
yes,
would the police choose to use a less lethal method?
That's right. You have to assess the situation. You have to come up with a plan as to how I'm going to deal with this situation, and then you have to act decisively, and of course within the parameters of the law in relation to whatever the situation is, regardless. And of course, as I said, police officers are not the persons that really treat with mentally challenged persons. We have persons from the ministry for that. But of course, we do have a role, and we are governed by regulations as respect to how we treat those persons. Yeah?
Yeah. All right, Inspector, we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Next week, we'll definitely get into some other topics as to how the police does what it do, or what it does. What is the correct grammar, Raucus?
Whichever one you say is the correct one.
We'll get into some more of, you know, what the police can do and what the police is doing to ensure that we stay safe. Inspector Steve Mc Kenzie with us here this morning.